So there's a lot of videos flying around like this at the moment, and if I really wanted to, I could just list a series of really vague but highly ubiquitous human personality traits and allow as many people as possible to continue identifying with the personality type of INFJ. Because for a multitude of reasons, a lot of people seem to want to be this type. Group 1 consists of people who just want to feel special. Group 2 consists of people who just want a type code to justify their feeling of perpetual inadequacy. And Group 3 is comprised of the people who consistently receive the INFJ type code from online tests. Well, to the first group, I say you are already special and unique, and a type code isn't going to make you any more special than you already are. To Group 2, I say you are stronger than you know. And to Group 3, I have to point out that online tests, even the best ones, are going to be no more than 50% accurate. So please, please, please do not rely on online tests to determine your personality type. Because the fact is, I really want this video to help people, and I'm not going to compromise my integrity just to get some likes and shares. And for this reason, I'm not going to use the dichotomies either, because yeah, I could say, well, INFJs are judging types, and therefore they're more likely to be conscientious, they're more likely to operate according to a schedule, be systematic, be consistent, be reliable. But the fact is, this dichotomy does not work. There's plenty of ENTPs, there's plenty of INFPs who are incredibly conscientious, incredibly disciplined. And there's plenty of INFJs who have absolutely no idea what they want from life, who spend so much time in their own heads that they don't consistently work to a schedule. And then I could say, well, the INFJ is a feeling type, and therefore they make decisions based upon their values, rather than cold and hard logic. And again, this would be absolute nonsense, because the fact is, every type is a thinking and feeling type. They just feel and think in different ways. And so many senses, particularly these ESFPs and ISFPs who are taken to these online personality tests, are receiving an intuitive score, who are highly intuitive, big picture oriented people, because they're uncertain of what they want from life, and they have not fully attached themselves to the concrete, to the tangible. Or perhaps an ISFP, for example, is so NI activated that they are in every regard more intuitive than they are sensing. Again, this dichotomy does not work. And then we get extroversion versus introversion. Finally, something we can actually use in order to actually help you determine whether or not you are an INFJ. But first of all, we must strip this dichotomy of all the superfluous nonsense it's acquired over the years. Let me clarify for you. An extrovert is no less lonely than an introvert. An extrovert does not necessarily need less alone time than an introvert. Introverts don't have a monopoly on loneliness. Introverts do not have a monopoly on alone time. And I also have to point out that extroverts are no more or less inclined towards philosophy than their introverted counterparts. So all of these stereotypes associated with introversion and extroversion, please, for the sake of this video, just chuck them out the window. And I will make a video exploring in much more detail and depth what extroversion and introversion actually are. But for the sake of this video, I'm just going to strip it down into the very core of what I believe extroversion and introversion to be. And this is, in cognitive terms, not behavioral terms, cognitive terms, proactivity versus reactivity. As a behavioral trait, extroverts are no more proactive than introverts, but on a cognitive level, an introvert is proactive, whereas an extrovert is reactive. And yes, to a certain extent, each of these types will be both, but generally speaking, an introvert is proactive because they think about what they're doing beforehand, because they form a vision of what they want to do, they store energy, and then they act in accordance with the conclusion of their internal dialogue. INFJs are introverts, and therefore, cognitively speaking, they are more proactive than they are reactive. An extrovert, even if they're alone, even if they're preoccupied with their own logical or emotional cogitations, are still largely in a reactive state. They're responding to external stimuli. They're finding new patterns through an external dialogue. And the ENTP, one of the most likely types to misidentify with being an INFJ, will spend many hours by themselves, but they will do so in a reactive state. They will do so through the creative exploration of an external medium. It might be going down a rabbit hole of research on the online world. It might be performing upon an instrument and forging new connections. But overall, they will be spending time reacting to the world rather than proactively engage with their own thoughts in order to determine how much energy is going to be spent interacting with the world in a more conservative fashion. So to reiterate, if you are reactive, if your primary dialogue is through reacting to the external world and you spend much of your time doing that even when alone, you're more likely to be an extroverted type. However, if your primary mode of operation is more proactive in nature, you're going to be spending a lot more time thinking about doing something than actually doing it. And by itself, this is an unreliable determinant of type, because there's 8 extrovert types and there's 8 introverted types. And each of these types can be one or the other based upon their life circumstances. Many extroverts are not in a position whereby they can react to the external world, and then they're forced to engage with their internal cogitation. They become more internally proactive. And many introverts are engaged so much with their projects that they are spending more time doing things, reacting to things, following a chain of causality, than they are reflecting within their own internal world. So by itself, this will not tell you if you're an INFJ or not, but it will help people determine whether they are more extroverted than introverted. But now that we've determined to some extent whether or not you're an introvert or an extrovert, it's time to move on to the INFJ specific traits. So first up is synergy. As many of you know, the INFJ has got introverted intuition as a dominant function. NI dominants have this in common. In an ideal world, everything an introverted intuitive dominant pursues informs another. For the INTJ, everything must be integrated into the identity of who they are. For the INFJ, everything must be integrated into their own introverted thinking frameworks. And therefore, if you have lots of different pursuits that do not inform one another, and you are very happy for these different pursuits to remain very much independent of one another, it is very likely you are not an INFJ, because the INFJ operates upon the basis of synergy. If an INFJ pursues anything, and if they undertake any new skill or hobby or career, if possible, they want that to flow neatly into everything else that you're interested in. It's not unusual for an INFJ to have multiple interests. It is unusual for the INFJ's multiple interests to be independent of one another. Because introvert intuition into introvert thinking, the dominant spark of the INFJ, is by nature synergistic. Everything must flow. Everything must be contained within a framework of interconnected webs. For myself, I'm a musician doing psychology. It is actually quite stressful for me to know that these two fields cannot be easily intertwined. Because synergy for an INFJ isn't a choice, it's not a natural strength, it's just something they have to do. If every pursuit, if every skill set, if every knowledge base of their life does not inform another, it can be very unsettling for the INFJ. Ideally, the INFJ seeks to blend everything into one universal framework. Which brings me to the third point of universalism. If you are somebody who has multiple different areas of interest, multiple different areas of expertise, but are very much happy to keep these areas of interest in boxes, in their own separate categories, without constantly thinking about how each of these categories is connected to the other one, you are very unlikely to be an INFJ, because the nature of introverted intuition and introverted thinking seeks to bring every single component of objective data into accord with the other one. And this is just the INFJ's nature, it is their primary utility. It is like an itch they constantly need to scratch. Introverted intuition surveying introverted thinking is very much aware of any kind of dissonance within the mind. If one stored value is in conflict with the myriad of other stored values, the INFJ doesn't necessarily become stressed, but it becomes something they must fixate on until they've brought that value into accord with the rest of the mind. Which brings me to the fourth point. If it hasn't already become perfectly clear from the last 2 points, the INFJ is an introverted thinker. The INFJ must, absent a extensive pursuit of type development, internalize logic before they can fully understand it, before they can apply it. The INFJ does not take new logic in their stride. The INFJ does not quickly assimilate new frameworks of understanding. They do not quickly assimilate new skill sets. Why? Because it falls back to the previous point. Not only must the INFJ internalize their data, not only must the INFJ internalize any kind of puzzle or problem, they must internalize it in such a way as to make the answer to that problem connect with the answers to all the other problems within their brain. It is not enough just to find the solution to something. It is not enough just to TISI it, if you like, such as with an ENTP or an INTP. The answer alone is not enough for the INFJ. The INFJ must also, going back to point number 2, synergize the answer with the rest of their introverted thinking framework. And so if you can quickly take logical problems in your stride, if you can quickly assimilate skill sets, if you can quickly acquire an understanding of a framework, particularly an external framework, it is somewhat unlikely you're an INFJ. Because yeah, INFJs can learn to do this. I have, and I'm getting increasingly better at acquiring new skill sets quickly. But I must still ruminate upon that skill set. I must still connect everything of that acquired skill, of that acquired understanding, with all of my other areas of understanding before I feel fully comfortable applying it to the real world. Fifth and final point, extroverted feeling, observation. So there are different kinds of extroverted feeling. I'm going to get to that in a minute. But first of all, I have to distinguish between extroverted feeling and introverted feeling. An INFJ is much more an extroverted feeler than they are an introverted feeler in terms of what they're conscious of. The INFJ is much more conscious of the emotions of other people than they are of their own emotions. This isn't to say they're completely unaware of their own emotions. It's not to say they are hyper aware of other people's emotions. This very much varies person to person, but it is to say the INFJ is so much more attuned to the emotions of the external world than they are to the emotions of the internal world. And they tend to prioritize in the moment, in the extroverted sensing moment, because that's the lens to which this codec is attached, the emotions of another person over their own. Exceptions being when the INFJ is so wrapped up in their own introverted thinking cogitations that they become oblivious to their extroverted feeling authority function. But that would only be in the presence of external emotional harmony in the first place. But any chaos of the external emotional world must be quite mild in order for that to be permitted. Because in the presence of extreme external emotional chaos, the INFJ would have a very difficult time fully activating their introverted thinking convergent auxiliary. And this brings me to the nature of the INFJ's extroverted feeling, because the fact is one simply cannot use extroverted feeling as a term in order to encompass the myriad of different employments between each and every type. Because the fact is, extroverted feeling in the divergent auxiliary conscious position that is the authority function within a type is a far cry from, say, the convergent auxiliary extroverted feeling of the ENTP, or the dominant function of the ESFJ, or the unconscious dominant of the INFP. Extroverted feeling is completely different across each and every type. And for those of you unfamiliar with CPT, this would be the perfect time to explain the difference between a divergent function and a convergent function. A convergent extroverted feeling, such as the ENTPs, the INFPs even, is a function that takes charge of another person's emotional experience. It acts upon the external world in order to enhance the emotional state of another person, or at the very least, change the emotional state of another person. Because it's not always going to be used with a positive intention, although more often than not, of course, it will be. Why do I keep bringing up the ENTP and indeed the INFP? It's because these two types are far more likely than other types to misdiagnose themselves as an INFJ. Because that very much explains this entire phenomena of this completely different type, identifying as an introverted intuitive feeling judging type, or indeed an introverted intuitive dominant. And any divergent function is the exact opposite of this. A divergent function is one outside of the realms of control. We do not take responsibility for the divergent world. Rather, we abide by it. We let it influence our dominant agenda. With the INFJ, the agenda is contained within the ego complex of introverted intuition and introverted thinking. And this is in reaction to the extroverted feeling, extroverted sensing world that the INFJ typically, unless they rotate on the dominant axis, does not take active responsibility for. If you take another person's emotional state in your stride, if you actively affect the emotional world around you, and if you do so in a way which is highly natural to you, it is very unlikely you are an INFJ, because the INFJ is an extroverted feeling observant type. They observe the emotional atmosphere and they rationalize it using their primary utility. And if they care enough, they will communicate the underlying causes of any given emotional disturbance to another person so that it doesn't happen again. More than that, owing to the authoritative nature of extroverted feeling within the INFJ will so oftentimes use social norms, use compliance with a general set of social parameters in order to avoid those situations where they have to take responsibility for the emotional state of another person. Because for as long as people act within this rule set, within this moral framework, if you like, within the social law, the INFJ can enjoy an emotionally harmonious world without needing to take responsibility for those emotions. And this is a huge reason why the more negative emotional experiences an INFJ will accrue, the stronger their drive to create and encourage others to comply with a general moral framework. Because it is this universal social rule set which will maintain an emotional atmosphere the INFJ isn't willing to take direct responsibility for. And this brings us neatly to the bonus point. And if you're still with me so far, thank you, you were awesome. So, many people who claim to be INFJs take pride in a certain emotionally predictive capacity. And this is somewhat ironic because the INFJ doesn't actually have that ability. The INFJ is not an emotionally predictive individual. They are a logically predictive individual. They are good debaters, for example, because if you give them a line of reasoning, their introverted intuition, introverted thinking will form a pattern, and oftentimes they'll be able to predict what you're about to say. That gives them time to think and formulate an answer before you've even finished making your point. And the reason people often think an INFJ is more emotionally predictive than they are, because it is the rationale of the INFJ, reflecting as it is upon extroverted feeling data, that allows the INFJ to predict, for example, undulations in a society, changes in the political environment, and even the development of another individual. However, this is a logical prediction. This is forming logical patterns within their brain at the behest of feeling data. This is not emotional prediction. And the emotionally predictive capacity they do have tends to be much more long-term in nature. If you find yourself intuitively connected to the emotional effect your words are about to have on another person, and you even, as so many ENTPs, particularly those who misidentify as INFJs, do, take pride in your ability to see another human being as a kind of emotional sounding board. So many people with extroverted intuition into extroverted feeling, the primary utility of the ENTP, can effectively gauge the emotions of another person and intuitively understand the emotional value of one sentence as opposed to another one. But the fact is, if you have this emotionally predictive capacity that operates outside of a framework of human conduct that we were talking about earlier in regards to the authority function of the INFJ, you yourself are very unlikely to be one. Extroverted sensing into extroverted feeling does not predict another person's emotional responses, it reacts to them. And furthermore, the divergent nature of these functions within the INFJ cognitive stack makes it fairly rare for the INFJ to ever employ extroverted feeling in a sufficiently convergent manner as to actively and directly, intentionally alter another person's emotional state. I'll say it again, INFJs do not predict emotions, they predict logic. And yes, logic and emotions do dip into one another, but INFJs dip into feeling from the perspective of logic rather than the other way around. Will an INFJ ever use another person as an emotional sounding board to the same extent as the ENTP? Well, in a manner of speaking, yes, but they wouldn't necessarily be able to form an idea of what that emotional reaction is going to be. The ENTP, on the other hand, is always going to be tied to the emotional reaction of another person. INFJs, absent extensive reflection and formulation frameworks, tend to be fairly clueless in this regard. It's not an intuitive activity. It is not an intuitive ability for the INFJ. And the extent to which INFJs tend to be HSPs tends to correlate with their inability to predict an emotional response. Why is that? It's because the INFJ, when they're having a conversation with someone, when they're just minding their own business maybe, they're not necessarily tied to the contingency of the emotional world around them. They do not have extroverted intuition, extroverted feeling. They're not a part of this extroverted feeling dialogue others may be privy to. And so much of the time they're not acting upon this emotional world. And as such, when the INFJ tends to encounter any kind of emotional stimuli, negative or otherwise, they haven't necessarily erected defenses in anticipation of it. They hadn't anticipated what would happen, and therefore it will affect them very, very, very strongly. And as such, if you are not only an active participant of the extroverted feeling world around you, but also fluidly, naturally, and intuitively predict the emotional responses of those around you, and can even choose between option A, B, and C based upon how you feel another person will react to it, it's fairly unlikely you are an INFJ. Because the extrovert feeling of the INFJ is divergent and therefore more observational. And attached as it is to an extroverted sensing lens, it is contained within the raw moment, the raw tangible concrete, much more than it is the fluid abstract world of extroverted intuition. And as such, any emotional prediction of the INFJ tends to be done on a much more internalized basis, which will generally be much more easy to access, absent a current stream of extroverted feeling data. The people who can ride the waves of extroverted feeling and very much steer their way through it in order to maximize their own and other people's emotional experience are much more likely to be, for example, ENTPs. So let's get to the summary. First off, if you are more reactive than you are proactive, it's unlikely you are an INFJ. I don't care if you need more alone time than other people. I don't care if you identify as more of an introvert than an extrovert using society stereotypes. The fact is, if your primary dialogue with reality is one which uses an external medium in order to find new connections and enhance your own life experience, and if you feel most comfortable and fresh and at home when you're doing this, you're more likely to be an extrovert. Because a huge portion of those people who inhabit an extroverted cognitive stack feel much more at ease when they're engrossed in an external medium, very much reacting to it as they allow the waves of life to carry them forward. Both extroverts and introverts are both reactive and proactive. And just to clarify, all extroverts have an introverted side and all introverts have an extrovert side. However, the primary utility of an extrovert is this reactive state. And there are also neutral cognitive types as well, which this would also very much apply to. The second point is synergy. If you can allow yourself to have multiple areas of interests without needing to combine all of these interests together in a way which mutually complements one another, you are very unlikely to be an INFJ. The third point is holistic internalization. If you are able to compartmentalize different areas of expertise without having this natural desire to take all the information outside of boxes and blend it all together into this fluid, organic, intuitive thinking framework, you are very, very unlikely to be an INFJ, because the thought pattern of the INFJ is holistic in nature. The INFJ cannot learn anything without needing to integrate it into everything else. Which brings us to the fourth point, very much combining the second and third together. The INFJ is an introverted thinker. And so holistic is their introverted thinking thought pattern that they cannot take new frameworks in their stride without spending a certain amount of time letting it brew inside their head. Because any new information for the INFJ must be given a certain amount of time to integrate with everything else. And as such, if you can easily take in new systems, new mechanisms, new facts, and even apply them on the get-go, well, you may be an introverted thinker. Introverted thinking, introverted sensing can do this quite well, particularly in the ENTP, for example. But it's very unlikely you'll be an INFJ, because the INFJ has introverted intuition and introverted thinking in the dominant stack. And therefore, the primary utility of the INFJ is to connect any information within their brain to everything else. The fifth point is, with introverted thinking being on one end of the spectrum within the dominant stack, within this convergent side of the INFJ, extroverted feeling as the authority function is alongside extroverted sensing in the divergent portion of the INFJ. And therefore, it's something they very much have to react against. It is not something they take responsibility for. And therefore, if you are somebody who acts upon the emotional world, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, whether you're an INFP, for example, or an ENTP, you are unlikely to be an INFJ. Because while the INFJ can do this, they generally have to rotate upon the dominant axis in order to employ extrovert sensing and extrovert feeling in a convergent manner. And generally this is hard to do, absent extensive type development, for a prolonged amount of time. ENTPs act upon the emotional atmosphere. INFJs observe the emotional atmosphere. However, getting to point 6, INFJs, while they do observe the emotional atmosphere, they do not predict it. They can predict a line of reasoning, they can predict the evolution of a society, speaking on grander terms, but they cannot predict half as easily the emotional responses of another person. And generally they'll use a social framework as a placeholder to ensure they do not have to. So long as an INFJ operates within the confines of the extrovert feeling imposed introvert thinking framework of moral acceptability, politeness, courtesy, they will not need to take responsibility, going back to point 5, of another person's emotions. So I could have taken a stereotype approach with this, I could have taken a dichotomies approach with this, I could have used heuristics all the way through, but I didn't want to. I wanted to give you real, applicable information to help you determine whether or not you or somebody you know is an actual INFJ. Because the more people can discover their true type, the more this community and this new emerging science as a whole can develop, and the more we are able to employ the framework to actually enhance our lives. So thank you so much for watching the video. I really appreciate your viewership. If you haven't already done so, make sure to leave a like. It really does help the channel grow, develop, and reach new audiences. And if you haven't already done so, make sure to click that subscribe button with a bell icon next to it down below to stay notified of future content. From this point onwards, I'm releasing 2 videos a week, so stay tuned for that. And just a reminder to everyone, I do have a type service, so if you ever at any point confused about your type, definitely check that out down below in the description. And definitely check out the CPT ebook if you're ever interested in exploring this fresh and fluid approach to personality typing in more depth. So again, thank you so much for watching the video. I hope it was informative, and I'll speak to you next time.